What if I told you that the most powerful person in any room isn't the one with the most friends, the biggest network, or even the most charisma? It's the person who is completely comfortable being alone. You know the type. Turns down social invitations without guilt, spends weekends alone without feeling lonely, seems unbothered by being left out of group activities. Society calls them antisocial. Friedrich Nietzsche called them something else entirely. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why this person possesses power that socially dependent people can never access, while crowds of people seeking connection stay perpetually weak. Or maybe you're that person who's been ashamed of preferring solitude. But first, let me show you exactly what I mean. You walk into a Saturday night and see two scenarios. In the first, there's Jennifer, frantically texting friends, stressed that her plans fell through, desperately scrolling social media to see what everyone else is doing. Classic socially dependent person. In the second, there's Thomas, sitting alone in his apartment, completely absorbed in a book, phone on silent, looking more content than Jennifer has felt in months. Who would you bet on to build something meaningful with their life? Hold that thought, because what I'm about to tell you will flip everything you believe about connection and success. Jennifer will spend her weekend feeling anxious and empty despite being surrounded by people. Thomas just spent time building knowledge and capacity that will compound for years. Jennifer needs constant social validation to feel okay. Thomas has discovered something that makes him immune to social manipulation. So why does everyone think Jennifer is healthy and Thomas is isolated? Here's the uncomfortable truth. You pity Thomas because he threatens everything you believe about how happiness works. That it requires constant connection, social validation, and fear of missing out. Nietzsche spent his life in solitude, and what he discovered was this. Society doesn't fear lonely people. We fear people who have embraced loneliness because they prove that everything we've been taught about needing others for fulfillment is a lie designed to keep us weak and controllable. But here's what Nietzsche knew that nobody talks about. The person who embraces loneliness isn't running from connection. They're accessing a level of personal power that social dependence makes impossible. While everyone else needs constant validation from others, they found something unshakable within themselves. And that power, that's exactly what will change your life. But to understand why, we need to dig into the one thing that makes people more uncomfortable than anything else. Nietzsche wrote, "The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe." But what happens when someone stops struggling and simply walks away from the tribe entirely? If you've ever felt guilty about wanting to be alone, this video is for you. Like, subscribe, and let's discover the power of solitude together. Leave a comment about the last time you chose to be alone, and everyone made you feel like something was wrong with you. That's the person who has embraced loneliness. They're a walking contradiction that breaks social norms. Has deep capacity for connection but doesn't need it constantly. Values relationships, but isn't desperate for them. Enjoys people, but is completely fine without them. Can spend days alone without feeling lonely. Turns down social obligations without guilt. Builds their life around internal satisfaction rather than external validation. And this terrifies us because if happiness doesn't require constant socializing, if fulfillment doesn't demand a busy social calendar, if power doesn't need approval from crowds, then what does that say about the exhausting social performance you've been maintaining your entire life? But here's where it gets really interesting. Nietzsche discovered something that explains why embracing loneliness creates power while avoiding it creates weakness. And it has nothing to do with being antisocial. Remember that uncomfortable feeling you get around people who genuinely don't need social validation? Nietzsche had a name for it. And once you understand what it is, you'll never see loneliness the same way again. Quick question. When was the last time you were truly alone without immediately reaching for your phone to connect with someone? Not just physically alone, but mentally alone, without texting, scrolling, or consuming content created by others. Just you with your own thoughts. Can't remember? That's the problem. Nietzsche discovered that our fear of loneliness isn't about connection. It's about avoiding the confrontation with ourselves that solitude forces. He called this the abyss, the void you see when you look inward without distraction. And in our culture, The biggest fear is being alone with that void long enough to see what's really there. But here's what Nietzsche knew. We perform social connection. We schedule hangouts we don't want. We maintain friendships out of obligation and scroll social media to feel less alone. Not because it fulfills us, but because we're terrified of what happens when we stop distracting ourselves from ourselves. Think about your last weekend. Did you spend time alone because you wanted to? Or did you fill every moment with social activities and digital connection because being alone felt unbearable? The person who has embraced loneliness doesn't fear that void. They've looked into it and found something everyone else is running from. And somehow, this is the part that breaks people's brains. What they found there made them more powerful than people who need constant social validation. Nietzsche wrote, "And those who were seen dancing were thought to be insane by those who could not hear the music." What makes you uncomfortable about solitary people is that they hear music you can't hear. That they've found fulfillment in places you're too afraid to look. That they're not dependent on the social validation you need to feel okay. But what if they're not the broken ones? What if the problem is your addiction to social validation that keeps you weak? Here's what the social media influencers don't want you to know. Constant connection is making you weaker, not stronger. Everything you've been taught about needing people is designed to keep you controllable. Nietzsche wrote, "In solitude, the lonely man is eaten by himself, in crowds, by the many." You think avoiding loneliness protects you, but you're being consumed by your need for others. The truly powerful understand something most people never access. Your power comes from within, and you can only access it in solitude. While you're seeking validation from others, they're building unshakable confidence from within. While you're afraid to be alone, they're using solitude to develop capacities you'll never have. While you're performing for social approval, they're becoming someone who doesn't need approval. This is why your social dependence keeps you weak. You're not building inner strength. You're building addiction to external validation. Remember Jennifer from Saturday night? While Thomas was using solitude to read, think, and develop himself, Jennifer was anxiously trying to fill a void that no amount of social connection will ever fill. Her fear of being alone was actually keeping her from the only thing that could make her strong. Nietzsche called this self-overcoming. When you stop running from yourself through social distraction and start confronting what's actually inside you, you become genuinely powerful. But here's the really crazy part. This confrontation feels terrible at first. It feels like loneliness, like isolation, like something is wrong with you. And that's exactly the social conditioning designed to keep you seeking validation, keep you controllable, keep you dependent on systems that profit from your fear of being alone. Nietzsche believed that one must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. The person who embraces loneliness has confronted their inner chaos, and from that chaos came something that socially dependent people never create. Original thought that doesn't need group approval. Authentic identity that doesn't shift based on who's watching. Unshakable core that can't be manipulated through social pressure. Now we get to the real reason society fears people who embrace loneliness. And it's not what you think. This isn't about individual preference. This is about control. Nietzsche wrote, "The surest way to corrupt a youth is to instruct him to hold in higher esteem those who think alike than those who think differently." But the person who embraces loneliness isn't seeking esteem from those who think alike. They've stopped caring about social esteem entirely, and that's terrifying to anyone who controls through social pressure. Think about it. Our entire social system depends on one belief, that you need other people's approval to be okay. You need friends to validate your worth. You need social media engagement to feel relevant. You need to be included, to be liked, to be part of the group. The person who embraces loneliness looks at this system and asks one simple question. What if I don't need any of that? And nobody has a good answer. They have power without needing validation, direction without requiring approval, identity without depending on others' perceptions. This makes them uncontrollable. Uncontrollable people are dangerous to systems built on social manipulation. But here's the deeper fear that keeps people trapped in social dependence. What if embracing loneliness is actually the path to power? What if solitude creates stronger individuals than constant connection? What if the people most comfortable alone are the ones who accomplish the most? If that's true, then millions of people have been weakening themselves through constant social seeking. They've been sacrificing their independence, their original thought, and their inner power for social acceptance that keeps them perpetually weak. The person who embraces loneliness represents proof that there's another way, a way that doesn't require constant validation or endless socializing. Nietzsche observed, "The higher we soar, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly." The person who embraces loneliness is soaring, and from that height, the social games everyone else plays look small and meaningless. But here's where this gets personal, because Nietzsche himself was the perfect example of what happens when someone fully embraces loneliness and discovers power there. Friedrich Nietzsche was literally the person who embraced loneliness completely, and his story proves this. His colleagues thought he was too isolated and antisocial. The academic world called him mentally unstable for his solitude. Society labeled him as lonely and pitiable for living alone. Nietzsche spent years in what looked like painful isolation to socially dependent people, living alone in various cities, spending months without meaningful social contact, writing in solitude that others called sad. Sound familiar? That's exactly what people say about those who embrace loneliness today. But here's what Nietzsche knew that his critics didn't. He had accepted something profound, that his greatest work required solitude, that social obligations diluted his thinking, that he could only access his deepest insights away from the distraction of others. And from that embrace of loneliness came philosophy that changed Western thought. The will to power, the Übermensch, the eternal recurrence, the critique of morality. All of these concepts shape how we understand human potential today. They all emerged from what looked like painful loneliness, but was actually chosen solitude that gave him access to depths of thought that social distraction makes impossible. This is the pattern with history's greatest contributors. They appeared lonely to their contemporaries because they chose solitude over social obligation. Einstein did his best thinking alone. Tesla worked in isolation. Virginia Woolf demanded a room of one's own. But society called them lonely, antisocial, or weird because people comfortable in solitude threaten social control. The person who embraces loneliness today is following the same pattern. And just like Nietzsche, they're not trying to maintain a busy social life or prove they're well-adjusted. They're using solitude to access capacities that constant connection makes impossible, deep thought that requires sustained focus, original creation that needs space from others' opinions, self-knowledge that only comes from time alone with yourself. And that embrace of loneliness looks sad to people addicted to social validation. Here's what Nietzsche knew that our culture is still learning. The person who embraces loneliness isn't suffering from isolation. They're accessing power that social dependence prevents. But maybe you're starting to recognize yourself in this description. Maybe you've always preferred being alone but felt ashamed of it. Nietzsche wrote, "And those who were seen dancing were thought to be insane by those who could not hear the music. But hearing that music requires recognizing these signs in yourself. Let me show you these signs. If you recognize them, understanding this will transform how you see your solitary nature." First sign, you feel more energized after time alone than after socializing. While extroverts claim they recharge through social connection, you recharge in solitude. Social events drain you even when they're enjoyable. Time alone restores you. Every forced social obligation leaves you feeling depleted. That's not social dysfunction. That's your natural energy pattern that society tells you is wrong. Second sign, your best ideas and deepest insights come when you're alone. Traditional social people brainstorm in groups. Your breakthroughs come in solitude. You've noticed that your most original thoughts happen when you're away from others' influence. Your clearest decisions emerge after time alone. Group thinking dilutes your judgment while solitude sharpens it. Sound familiar? That's not antisocial behavior. That's accessing mental capacities that social distraction prevents. Third sign, you're comfortable canceling plans and feel relief, not guilt. Social obligations that you agreed to feel increasingly burdensome as they approach. When something cancels, you feel freed rather than disappointed. You've learned to turn down invitations without the guilt others seem to feel. Being flaky isn't irresponsibility. It's your authentic self rejecting obligations your conditioned self accepted. Fourth sign, you have a rich inner world that's more interesting than most social interactions. You could spend hours with your own thoughts, ideas, and imagination. Most conversations feel shallow compared to the depth you explore alone. You're not bored when alone. You're engaged with internal reality that others can't access. Fifth sign, you see through social games and find them exhausting rather than engaging. The posturing, the small talk, the performance of connection, you see it all clearly. While others play social games unconsciously, you're aware of the mechanics and find them tiresome. You'd rather be alone than participate in shallow social rituals. Sixth sign, your life's direction comes from internal clarity, not external input. Socially dependent people need others' advice, approval, and validation for decisions. You've learned that your clearest direction comes from solitary reflection. Time alone gives you certainty that social input only confuses. You trust your own counsel more than group consensus. Seventh sign, you're accused of being distant, aloof, or not making effort, but you feel more authentic than ever. People say you're hard to reach, that you don't engage enough, that you're becoming isolated. But internally, you feel more aligned with your true self than when you were performing social connection. Their concern feels like pressure to betray yourself. You've been taught to see these as signs of unhealthy isolation. You've been told you need more social connection, that humans are social animals, that something is wrong with preferring solitude. Nietzsche would tell you to stop listening. He'd tell you that your embrace of loneliness isn't dysfunction, it's evolution beyond social dependence. When you stop apologizing for your solitary nature and start honoring it, you gain access to genuine power, not the fragile confidence that requires constant social validation, but unshakable inner authority that comes from confronting yourself in solitude and building something real there. This is why solitary people often accomplish disproportionate things. When you're not exhausting yourself maintaining social obligations, you have energy for deep work. This is why they seem so confident despite social distance. When you're not basing your worth on others' approval, nothing can shake your sense of self. But accepting this truth, that you're meant to embrace loneliness rather than fear it, that's the hardest part. Now comes the practical question. How do you embrace loneliness in a world that pathologizes solitude? Nietzsche believed that the individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. But once you recognize your solitary nature, you need a framework for honoring it without apologizing. First, stop justifying your need for solitude. You don't owe anyone an explanation for why you want to be alone. When someone asks why you're not being social, "I prefer solitude" is a complete answer. The moment you start justifying, you're implying your preference is wrong and needs defending. The person who has embraced loneliness understands their nature is valid simply because it's theirs. Second, distinguish between chosen solitude and fearful isolation. Chosen solitude feels peaceful, energizing, like coming home to yourself. You're alone because you want to be. Fearful isolation feels anxious, empty, like hiding from life. You're alone because you're afraid. When you've chosen solitude, you feel powerful. When you're hiding in isolation, you feel small. Learn to recognize the difference. Third, develop what Nietzsche called self-overcoming through solitude. Use your time alone not just for rest, but for confronting yourself. Who are you without others watching? What do you actually think versus what you've adopted from others? What emerges when you sit in silence with no distraction? This is the crucible where authentic self is forged. But here's the most important part. You have to stop measuring your worth by social metrics. Society wants you to measure success by friend count, social calendar fullness, and popularity. Social media promises fulfillment through connection and engagement. Everyone celebrates being social while pitying those who prefer solitude. But Nietzsche understood something deeper. The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. That struggle means choosing yourself over social approval repeatedly. Your power might develop in years of solitude that look lonely to others. Your greatest work might emerge from isolation that society calls sad. Your authentic self might only appear when you're completely alone. And that's not failure. That's the path to genuine power. Think about it. Every person who embraced loneliness was told they were isolated and pitiable. Nietzsche himself was pitied for his solitary life. His embrace of loneliness looked sad for decades to socially dependent people. But when his philosophy started revealing depths that social thinkers never reached, everything he'd been doing in solitude suddenly became undeniable. His supposed loneliness turned out to be the only way he could access the insights that changed philosophy. The same pattern happens over and over. The person everyone pitied for being alone suddenly produces work that crowds of social people never create. Because while everyone else was performing social connection, they were building genuine capacity. While others were seeking validation, they were developing unshakable inner authority. While others were afraid to be alone, they were accessing power in solitude. Here's what nobody tells you about embracing loneliness. Your power will manifest, but it won't look like social success. Let me say it again. Nietzsche wrote, "One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star." You've been sitting with your inner chaos while everyone else distracts themselves socially. You've been confronting yourself in solitude while they've been avoiding themselves through connection. And that confrontation gives you something social dependence can never provide. The ability to stand alone without needing validation, to think originally without group approval, to act from inner authority rather than social pressure. But your power won't announce itself through social proof. It won't fit the success narrative that social media celebrates. Instead, it will feel quiet, internal, like something you know about yourself that others can't see. The work you complete in solitude will speak for itself. The clarity you gain from time alone will guide decisions others agonize over. The strength you build from embracing loneliness will carry you through situations that break socially dependent people. And when that moment comes, all the years of being called lonely will reveal themselves as your greatest advantage. Every time you chose solitude was actually you building power others feared to access. Every moment alone was actually you developing capacities that social distraction prevents. Society fears people who embrace loneliness because they can't be controlled through social pressure. They prove that maybe the problem isn't isolated people who need more connection. Maybe the problem is a culture that pathologizes solitude because independent people threaten systems built on social control. If you're someone who prefers being alone, if your greatest accomplishments came from solitude, if you've been called lonely despite feeling more powerful alone than in crowds, Nietzsche would recognize you immediately. You're not lonely. You're not antisocial. You're not damaged by isolation. You're accessing power through embracing loneliness that socially dependent people will never understand. The question isn't whether you need more social connection. The question is whether you'll have the courage to embrace your solitary nature even when everyone tells you something is wrong with you. Because Nietzsche was right. The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away from the tribe entirely and discover who you are in solitude. Even when the world calls that loneliness, the person who embraces loneliness isn't society's failure. They're proof that the greatest power comes from within, not from others. And that's exactly why socially dependent people fear them. If this video made you see solitude differently, or if you recognize yourself as someone who's been ashamed of preferring to be alone, let me know in the comments. What did you discover about yourself in solitude that you never could have found in company? And if you want more content that celebrates the power of solitude in a world obsessed with connection, subscribe and hit that notification bell because we're just getting started with truths that social media doesn't want you to hear.